Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the InnerFight podcast. I hope you've had a great week, and I hope you're ready maybe to get your mind blown a little bit, but more to be inspired by what my guest today has to speak about. Did you know that there are only around 10 million type 1 diabetics in the world? I was actually quite surprised by that. I was even more surprised that type 2 diabetics account for around 500 million people. And that's not to mention those who are in the category of pre-diabetic. We talk about that a little bit as well. This show is inspiring in the way that my guest today talks about finding out about his type 1 diabetes and then cracking on with his life and some of the insane athletic goals he has whilst managing this disease, which he only found out about when he was 14 years old. Of course, we talk about what's happening with the type 2 diabetics, what people can do to avoid becoming a type 2 diabetic, and more importantly, if you are type 1 or type 2, how to get involved in physical exercise, what to look out for, and how to manage this disease. Who better to talk about it to than someone like Toby, who at 14 years old was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and still has these amazing athletic goals. This week's show announcements brought to you from InnerFight in Dubai. Yes, I'm back from Amsterdam. What a weekend. Pretty unreal. Hail, rain, half marathon, personal bests, thousands of people, and also had 2 hours standing waiting for my kit after the race in the freezing cold and witnessed a fine act of, I would say, generosity of humanity, where a gentleman actually gave me his coat because he saw I was absolutely freezing. Anyway, on with this week's show announcements. Next week is not this Friday, the Friday that the show comes out. Next Friday is Final Fridays, 5 p.m. here at InnerFight. We are celebrating, supporting breast cancer awareness. It is an opportunity to wear pink. It's an opportunity to do all of the CrossFit workouts that are named after females, which is quite a cool concept. There's Grace, there's Isabel, there's Fran, there's loads of those. I'm not 100% sure which ones Andy has put in quite yet, but it will be awesome. It's open to everyone, and all of the workouts are doable by everyone as well. 5 p.m. next Friday, the last Friday of every month here at InnerFight. Speaking of fitness competitions, the 10th and 11th, or the 11th and 12th of November is the Turf Games. We have 6 teams preparing pretty hard for the Turf Games, so put that in your diary. The first teams, or the top teams, are on the Friday night, and then on the Saturday, it's pretty much a full day event at Sports City at the track there. So if you're looking for something to do that weekend, 11th of November, it will be absolutely brilliant weekend. That is absolutely for sure. It is a whole day of fitness, really fit people, and a lot of not so fit but incredibly inspiring people as well. As I said, we have 6 teams involved in that, and they would love to have your support. Keeping It Fitness, the Open, the 2024 Open is coming. CrossFit have announced a few different structural changes, which doesn't change anything for the first part of the competition. That starts at the end of February. It's 3 workouts, 1 workout every week for 3 weeks, and we will be running them here as we do weekly for everyone to take part in. We'll be talking a lot more about that on the show and on various platforms in the coming weeks, months, as we lead into the 2024 CrossFit Games season. One announcement on the endurance side: on the 5th of November is the Dubai Women's Run. I'm giving you a little bit of advanced warning about this, advanced notice about this. I think this is really cool. Dubai Women's Run is on the 5th of November for all the ladies out there. It is something that's quite cool. It's pretty much what we would consider a fun run. It's not super serious. Yes, you can still get anxious, pre-race nerves and stressed about it. That's for sure. We can do that anytime, but it is to celebrate women in running, which I think is absolutely awesome. That is the 5th of November. That's all for this week's show announcements. Let's get into the show. This is episode number 848 of the InnerFight podcast. Diabetes with Toby Buckland. Enjoy the show. Toby, popular demand back on the show, mate. We've only just listened to the first edition on strength.
Yeah, pleasure to be back.
Diabetes. We have to be, we were talking about this just before we started recording. We have to be fair here, mate. There is a massive difference between what you have, which is type 1 diabetes, and type 2 diabetes, which I think we will labor on quite a lot and maybe be rude to some people. Anyway, let's understand what are we talking about, mate, when we're talking about diabetes? What is it?
So diabetes kind of it's a condition regarding insulin secretion and efficiency or uptake in the body. So type 1 diabetes is a condition where the body produces zero insulin
right
at the end of the day. And type 2 diabetes is a condition where of the insulin the individual produces, it's not utilized properly. So it's over-secreted for an X amount of carbohydrate or the response, and B, of that insulin that is secreted, it's not used efficiently. So it's the body's not very sensitive to the insulin that's been released.
Mate, you're very well educated, as came across in the podcast we did on strength. Let's wind back. You're talking about insulin, you're talking about sensitivity. Why is any of this important to us as human beings?
Yeah, so a part of being a human being is we need some food. So of that food that is uptaken in the body, so we have, you can really break it down to, proteins, fats, carbohydrates. So when we're worried about diabetes, it kind of all comes around to the carbohydrate utilization in the body.
Right.
And well, why is that important? Carbohydrates obviously are the kind of the main or primary source of energy. Obviously there's some other steps involved, but when we're at anything kind of above a low intensity, as well as other very important processes in the body, carbohydrate and glucose is a vital part of being a human being. And
some people are born with the inability to convert the food, carbohydrate, into energy. That's basically what we're talking about here, is that if people understand what Toby said, which is carbohydrate going in or energy going into the body, we need certain things to happen in the body, and we need certain chemicals sounds a bit bad, but that's basically, we weren't talking about doping earlier, honestly. We need certain chemicals in the body to break that food down, to turn that into energy to sustain life.
Definitely, right. So in simple terms, basically insulin can be described as kind of a anti-catabolism or a shuttle hormone.
Yeah.
Okay, so it helps shuttle glucose into the cells that need it at the time, in its kind of most simple way of describing it.
Type 1 diabetics it's a problem from birth. It's a deficiency, it's a disease from birth.
Yes and no. Yeah. Yes and no. So it's an autoimmune condition. Some people are born with it. Some people can develop it through an unknown amount of factors involved. There can never be one single factor. Sometimes there is. I mean, maybe like a serious virus or something like that. For myself, I don't quite know how I developed it. I mean, maybe it was my diet at the time, stress, viruses, whatever, X, Y, and Z. But it came to the point where, so I stopped producing insulin.
How old were you when that happened?
It was a week before my 15th birthday is when I got the diagnosis. So, 14.
Talk us through how you got to the point where you were diagnosed, mate. What did you start to feel different, behave different, sleep all the time, have no energy?
Yeah, exactly right. So super lethargic, and massive highs and lows and fluctuations in energy, basically.
Right.
So it's kind of a spectrum from when you are non-diabetic to type 1 diabetic. So your insulin secretion decreases slowly. So it's not you wake up one day or you go to bed and you produce insulin, you wake up, you don't produce any insulin. So it's a slow kind of diminishing process of insulin secretion. So across kind of a 2 or 3 month period.
That's quite quick.
Yeah, I guess in the grand scheme of things, yeah, it is quite fast. So basically, obviously, if you don't produce any insulin, you can't absorb or utilize any of the glucose that you've eaten, and as a result, you basically can't utilize energy from food. Is what it comes down to. Even people could argue, oh well, if you had fats and proteins, blah 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 blah, but the energy process of utilizing energy from fats and proteins is gluconeogenesis. So even if you eat fat, it still gets converted to glucose before you have to use it. So that argument's out the window. Bottom line is I didn't have any energy for basically 2-3 months. And of the glucose I consumed, it just circulated in the system and never was uptaken.
Can you remember that, like the start of those 2 to 3 months?
Yeah. So actually, this is a good story. So I remember it would have been about it would have been around, so my birthday's February, so 2 months before that would have been around Christmas. And
Don't forget, folks, what's day? What day?
The 4th.
I mean, it's coming soon, right?
Yeah.
So 4th of Feb, send in flowers.
So I remember I was at my mate's house for a Christmas party, and I would have been 14 years old at this time and sleeping on his floor at the time. And I remember I woke up in the night and I'd wet myself. And, you know, for a 14-year-old, you kind of hope you're at that stage by now. And super embarrassing, super confused. I didn't know him that well at the time. I mean, he's one of my best friends now, but I did not know him that well at the time. Not well enough to kind of wake him up and ask for a hand. I remember staying up all night trying to Google how to get urine out the floor. No. But anyway, so that was the kind of start of it. And that was super weird. Thought it was an anomaly. But then over that kind of 2-3 month period, I was getting up and going to the toilet 5, 6, 7 times a night. So you're not even sleeping at that point, because one of the ways the body gets rid of excess glucose in your blood is to urinate. Right. Yeah. So that's a big driving factor. So people who are undiagnosed type 1 diabetics will find they drink a lot more water because they're having to go to the bathroom the whole time, and B, they go to the bathroom the whole time. Mate, you're scaring me now because I drink a shit ton of water and I pissed. I had a piss 10 minutes before we were going to start recording the show, and then just as we were going to start, I went for another one. So I'm not going to get checked. Okay. So you've woken up at your mate's house, you've wet the bed, you're 14, and you can't quite figure out why. Yeah, I mean, at that time, it was still, there wasn't enough going on for me to think there's a problem. So, you know, you're a 14-year-old kid, you've got, the last thing you want to know is, or the last thing you want everyone to know is that you're wetting yourself. Yeah. So you keep it to yourself. Oh, no. So me and my friend had a pact, you know, we're not going to tell anyone, we'll just crack on. So fast forwarding kind of 2 months, as a 14-year-old rugby player at the time, you know, keeping on weight, being as strong as possible for a pre-pubertal 14-year-old is important. And anyway, I kind of just diminished in that 2 months. I lost probably about 14 kilos, or 14 to 18 kilos in body mass, which for a 14-year-old who's not hit puberty yet is a lot in a short period of time. And by the time it kind of came around to my birthday, I looked like a skeleton. So, that was the point basically. And my same friend, his mum was the one to say, you need to go to hospital. And so she rang up the school the next day. X, Y, and Z's got this problem. I think he's diabetic. But she didn't tell me, obviously. She doesn't want to be the one to break that news to me. Kind of identified no one wants to be. Yeah, she was some kind of physician, I think a physio, but obviously is fairly switched on. Yeah. And then went to hospital, got the diagnosis. How do they test you? Just glucose in the urine. Yeah. It's a very simple detection. How do they break it to you, mate? And maybe it's dramatic, maybe it's not. But like you said, when you're that age, you're
you're quite fragile in a lot of ways, aren't you?
A lot of people are still fragile. Yeah.
Yeah, when you're old, you're still fragile. You go more
pretend,
fragile.
You pretend, yeah.
Yeah, but talk us through how, like, what was your sort of immediate reaction? Did you understand what it was?
There was never a clear, Mr. Buckland, you're diabetic. It was just had the test, nothing was said, moved to the hospital ward, and they introduced me to insulin, basically. Wow. So there was never because remember there was still questions, because I remember at the time I was 100% all in on joining the military, and so the nurses didn't know at the time, obviously, and they didn't know it'd be a big deal telling me. But anyway, it kind of just brushed over it. Nothing intentional, I'm sure, but the diagnosis was kind of brushed over into insulin. I remember thinking, so am I diabetic? And they just said, yeah. Like what do you mean? Is this not been? Yeah. So it was, the problem was assumed, I guess. And I like to think I don't take anything to heart, but I was probably quite angry for a good year or so. Not anyone in particular, just at the situation.
Do you think that's a normal reaction, mate?
I would say so. I think it'd be normal not to be, right? Yeah. You're just a 14-year-old kid. You got enough to worry about.
And no support for it, really.
Yeah. So there is support systems in place. I mean, we're very lucky in the UK with the NHS.
Yeah.
But the support is what you make of it, and also what people you get, obviously. So you have the specialist nurses and doctors and X, Y, and Z. But at the end of the day, it's you're managing your condition, definitely, from the start.
That's heavy for 14.
There's worse things. There's worse things.
There are, mate. You know, I mean, there's young kids getting diagnosed with leukemia at age 9, and you know, there's a lot of sort of different thought processes how you should tell them, whether you should tell them, whether you shouldn't tell them, you know, what bits. And but I mean, for you, you know, like you say, you're just straight on insulin, and this is the way. And I guess maybe you'd heard about diabetes before, but probably you hadn't. It's not something, I don't think it's not on the curriculum, is it?
No, no. It's kind of a condition in the shadows, I guess, because also of diabetics I've met, everyone's quite private about it. Whether that's intentional or non-intentional, I think maybe it's also kind of not the cure, the management for it, right? Injections. People don't like needles. People don't like people seeing people put things in each other's bodies. Right? Yeah, I guess is probably. And so it's not like a lot of people have problems with needles, and nothing against them, but you can't get around the fact of having to get a needle out and inject yourself, even if the needle is as small as it is. I think it's not even 4 millimeters long.
Yeah.
People don't like it, you know.
Were you okay with needles before?
I'm not too squeamish or anything like that. It was, I mean, it's a necessity at the end of the day.
So flu jabs as a kid, you're okay with?
No. Good question. Okay with the procedure, maybe not okay with the ethics, but we won't get into that.
It's a whole different thing, man. So I'm just trying to put the journey together. Yeah. So you're in the hospital. They've told you're straight on insulin.
Yeah.
So you just after your 15th birthday.
Just before my 15th.
Just before your 15th, and you sort of go home, and you're now, let's call it a diagnosed type 1 diabetic.
So kind of the management for it at the time, when you're early diabetics, you're still producing insulin. So a small amount at the time. But you still produce a relative amount of insulin, and the management for it is obviously relative to carbohydrate intake. So when you're early diabetic, they kind of really have to nurse you through the steps of X, Y, and Z to X, Y, and Z of insulin and carbohydrate. So they just give you a fixed amount. Right. So they said just inject this amount 15 minutes before you eat. 3 times a day, 4 times a day. Yeah.
So it's almost like just taking a tablet, but it's
exactly right. And then as you kind of progress in your diabetic journey, you kind of tweak it and dial it in a bit more with ratios of insulin to carbohydrates, and then we can talk about pre and post exercise.
I was going to say, mate,
Z.
maybe this is an opportunity to talk about ratios of insulin injection to ratios of Fit Aid consumption.
Yeah, good one. Yeah,
as your new sponsor.
Yeah. Didn't know I was allowed to plug it on the podcast, so I kept it quiet.
Talk about them as much as you want. So there's this drink called Fit Aid, and if I have it, I need to know. But I mean, that's really what we're trying to manage here.
Yeah.
Like the amount of insulin that we need based on. So I guess talk us through that journey, mate, and where have you got to? Because it's an area that I haven't even thought. You've got a glucose monitor in your arm that probably wasn't available 10 years ago.
No. So even in the 1990s or early 2000s, a lot of diabetics in the first world were still having to boil urine to test their blood sugars. Yeah, so it's come a long way. Now it's just connected to Bluetooth on my phone, which is insane, right? So when I was first diabetic, it's kind of somewhere in between. So it's finger prick test.
I was going to say finger prick.
Yeah, so I still use it regularly if the sensor is being funny. They're not always perfect.
Right.
I'll still finger prick, use a finger prick.
This is interesting. So everyone that's running around with these things, these glucose monitors in their arms, what is the variance that you see between, like, what do you trust, mate? Do you trust that, or do you trust the finger prick?
The finger prick, for sure.
Always.
I think the monitor on my arm is super useful because it shows the trend and it shows the rough quantities. But if you were going for an exact measurement, the finger prick is probably always going to win.
Tom was talking about it I don't know if he was talking about it on our show when we had the endurance guys on, or whether talking about it on the endurance podcast.
Yeah.
That Boz had seen her glucose monitor in her arm and basically should have been flat on the floor, and was freaking out. And then Tom has the finger, I don't know why, but he has a kit at home.
Of course he does.
And he went and checked it, and she's obviously absolutely fine. And just like that, she went from being quite sort of unsure of things, and like, this thing's telling me that I'm just about to hit the deck, but going, well, I'm just fine again.
It's that there was that study, wasn't there, where someone told someone they gave them a life-ending drug, and it was just a placebo, right? And they had kind of heart attack, rhythmic, cardiac patterns, and X, Y, and Z. And they were told, as soon as they were told they were a placebo, they were absolutely fine. Yeah,
it's the tool is useful. Having a glucose monitor for someone like yourself is you find it really useful.
Definitely, because it not only shows you where your glucose is at, plus or minus a small margin of error, but it shows you roughly the direction it's going in as well. So with a finger prick, you're kind of blind. You test it, and it's just a moment in time. It doesn't show you the direction it's going in. So you could test it once, and it'd be perfectly in the range, and then you test it 10 minutes later, and you should be flat on the floor. Whereas at least with the sensor in your arm, it can give you a rough kind of trend or direction
over time.
So
you're back home. You're 3 times a day injecting yourself.
A week later, my mum serves me a birthday cake. I remember that moment. She won't forgive herself for it, I don't think. Still had a few slices at the time.
Did you?
Yeah, not really, no. I mean, I still eat good food. But yeah, so a week later, birthday cake, I left kind of school for a few weeks, as you do. And then, just straight back to it. I very much had the mentality, this could be worse, right? Like, it's not leukemia, it's not leprosy, it's not, do you know what I mean? It's a manageable disease. And whether you're type 1 or type 2, I mean, type 2 is reversible to a point, depends on how much damage you've given yourself.
We'll come to those fuckers in a minute.
But type 1 is a very manageable disease, and there's even, you could argue with, there's some of the science coming out now, it's not a biohacking tool, but using insulin can be manipulated and can be beneficial to some individuals. And you've got that Novo Nordisk cycling team, which is a great documentary on. And some of the studies in those guys is incredible. Whether they're taking extra stuff on the side, as all cycling teams maybe not do, I don't know. But so there's studies, like, they have pre and post exercise more than 15% more muscle glycogen than non-diabetics. And what am I trying to get at here? Kind of lost myself. Basically, what I'm saying is it's a very manageable disease.
Yeah.
It's tough, and you have to always be concentrated on the numbers, and it's always going to be in the back of your mind, whether you're awake or asleep or whatever, but it could always be worse.
And that's the mindset that you sort of left the hospital with, or you got into in the early days, was it, mate? It's like you said, it's not life-threatening. It is life-threatening, but managed. It's easily manageable. It's a disease that's been around for, actually don't even know, I wouldn't say hundreds of years, but we've known about it for a very long time. Yeah. And you've got that you leave the hospital with the tools directly to deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a survival starter kit, really, is what they give you. You know,
brilliant.
A glucose monitor, an insulin pen. You have the internet now, which is great.
Yeah.
And you're on your way. Like, you know, it's tough, and you make errors and things change. You know, especially as you go through puberty with lots of hormones and emotions and stress and all this kind of stuff in place. But you can get as complicated as you want with it. But at the end of the day, when you have carbohydrates, you inject insulin.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, just had that mindset from the off, right? It's an individual disease. I can't give it to other people, or I can't get other people to manage it for me unless maybe I'm a child, and then a parent would inject their child, which that must be incredibly tough.
Yeah.
And then you have your every 3 months, you have your HbA1c done.
Right.
Which basically is a measurement or relative measurement of your average blood glucose, and you just go off that, and that's the kind of number that diabetics they base their management off.
Does it get better, or does it get worse, or are you because you're super healthy, you're fit, you're working out, so are you seen to be improving your situation, or your illness, let's call it?
Yeah.
Or is it just hit a point where it won't improve? I mean, you won't not be diabetic. We know that.
Yeah. So the goal, right, of living kind of ish is to be in homeostasis, right?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we want to challenge the system so it improves and adapts, but the goal is to be in homeostasis. And so, basically when you're diabetic, there's a range you want to try and keep in,
right?
The kind of homeostatic range.
Right.
And that HbA1c is hemoglobin, something, blah, 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 glucose average, basically.
Right.
Kind of shows you how much glucose has been stored in the red blood cell over time.
Right.
And how damaged the red blood cell is. And so that basically you aim for the goal of a normal human being, right? So if your diabetes management is poor, and maybe you haven't got your insulin ratios dialed in, or you're lazy with injections, or your diet's poor and there's huge fluctuations, your HbA1c can be higher than normal.
Yeah.
Okay, and so that's bad for a number of reasons, including oxidative damage, increased blood pH, for what I was trying to think of, when your circulation isn't as good as it should be,
right,
of your capillaries and arteries. So that, there's measurements we can look at to try and improve, but that measurement doesn't improve or get worse over time. It just depends on your management in that 3 month period.
Did you ever think sort of, right, if I'm into sport, if I live a healthy life, if I eat well, then managing this situation, this disease, is going to be a lot easier?
Yes and no, because you can shoot yourself in the foot with it too.
Right.
Because if you're too on it and you're too reactive to blood glucose and too reactive with the insulin pen, to what those blood glucose is, then a lot of the time, which I found over the last, I've had it for just over 9 years now.
Yeah.
You basically have low blood sugar a lot.
Right.
Which compared to high blood sugar is worse for different reasons. So high blood sugar is worse kind of chronically, in the sense of over a period of time, it can cause damage to the system and the organs and blah, blah, blah. And low blood sugar is kind of damaging acutely, right? It's, you can cause a lot of problems, very quickly having low blood sugar.
It surprises me that people, like you said, don't inject, don't figure it out, don't strive for it doesn't surprise me, but it is a little bit mind-blowing that when you know you've been dealt a little bit of a tricky one, is a little bit of a curveball. I mean, you probably quite rightly and quite humanely admit that you prefer not to have it, but you've been dealt it.
Yeah.
You're not trying to, like you seem to have done, you're engineering it in a way that you can still live a perfect life, let's say.
I mean, why make it your worst enemy?
Yeah.
You're not affecting anyone else. I mean, you're affecting those around you.
Yeah.
But other than that, you're just shooting yourself in the foot and those around you. So you have to make it your friend. You have to work with it.
Might be interesting for some people that there's actually somewhere in the region of, give or take, probably give a couple more, around 10 million people that have the condition that you have, that are either born or you sort of can develop it because it's a disease that you can develop, type 1 diabetes, or it rears its head when you're 14 and trying to hang out with your mate and wetting the bed and what have you. You know, that's when it comes to fruition. But there's, give or take, about 10 million of you
waiting for the next wave after these vaccinations. Just you wait.
Let's see. What we hear more commonly, mate, is, which if we sort of wrap up a little bit what we said, if you're very conscious of the disorder, you can live with it. It's not debilitating in any way. It's not holding you back. You were just in Qatar at the weekend. You won a CrossFit competition. You're in great physical shape. Your tan is amazing.
There's no reason why you cannot succeed with type 1 diabetes.
Right.
There's no reason why you can't live to 90, 100 plus years old.
Yeah.
It's, if anything, technically, so if you had glucose, you would have an insulin response. Your blood sugar would probably spike if it was a high GI meal, and your insulin would probably overcompensate.
Yeah.
And so you would have a big fluctuation in your blood glucose. I could technically have an unlimited amount of carbohydrates, and as long as I manipulate my insulin levels enough, my homeostatic level of blood glucose is going to be level.
It'll be the same.
So
you actually have more tools than I have to perform.
Yes, I know. So that's all well and good if you get it correct.
Yeah.
You know, but the amount of times I've got it incorrect and woken up in hospital, or
many. Really?
Yeah.
Trying to perform?
Just to strict and on it and over injecting the whole time. So if you over inject for the relative amount of carbohydrate, you're going to have low blood glucose. So the intake of insulin lowers blood sugar. So it was a big problem until it's still ongoing here and there.
I was going to say, mate, so as a general thing, what should we know that you haven't told us already?
So don't start. We do need a meeting about that. So only really recently, until kind of the last 3 years of 9, is it been somewhere where I'm not on the floor every other day.
Wow.
And that's the reality of it. But equally, some people, they might think their management's amazing and they actually have high blood glucose for 6 months straight, and the damage they're doing to their organs, they can't even see yet. It's a bit pessimistic. But either way, if you're on it and you do your due diligence on it, there's no reason. But as everything, it's difficult, and there's obstacles in the way, and it's multifactorial, you know, the management of it on hormones and exercise and stress and emotions and even the weather.
Yeah.
You know? Like you're trying to balance the conditions of everything.
Yeah. It mixes well with Dubai summers, you find?
Yeah.
Did you find, because obviously, mate, you moved here at the start of July.
Yeah.
It's absolutely savage. Did you find it like harder, do you think? Or again, is it trying to find the sweet spot?
Potentially it's easier because you can eat more freely out here with the glucose, and your body just seems to, it is the heat, right? And your utilization of glucose is just relatively higher compared to a colder climate.
Yeah.
I think if I lived in Finland or
struggle,
or a North American winter or something like that, I think you're very, very sensitive to the glucose you consume. Probably again, because of a number of reasons, in the sense of you're not walking around here as much, you're not, and the weather. But out here, it's difficult. The heat is just difficult for everything, right? It's not just a glucose standpoint. But
do you feel a big I mean, it's a little bit of a side note and probably not related to diabetes, but how do you feel training wise here compared to colder climates? And it's been exceptionally hot, so it's probably,
I've got the most exaggerated form of it, right? Yeah. So initially it was tough, right? That first track Tuesday, it's 6 a.m. and you're struggling. But I mean, again, we can get into the adaptation caused from heat and blah, blah, blah. But 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, I feel pretty good out here.
Better.
Body wakes up and it's loose.
Yeah.
You don't wake up all stiff because you've been cold for 3 months.
Yeah.
Joints feel healthier, whether that's just general blood flow or...
I think it's that, and maybe...
sun and...
I think there's that as well, mate. The reason I asked the question is I always feel... In Dubai, I always feel my readiness to train and my ability to train hard is a lot higher than in the UK.
Yeah, I would agree.
And it's blood flow is one thing, and mate, you go my hometown York, I go and run intervals down by the river, it's pissing rain and 4 degrees and I'm on my own. Like, is it going to be easier or harder than running with 50 people at the track in 28 degrees?
Yeah, exactly. It's environmental as well, in the sense of culturally environmental. Yeah. The people you're around as well as physically. Yeah, definitely.
Let's jump into the other side of it. We've spoken a lot about type 1 diabetes, and really you guys are the minority. We said somewhere around 10 million, maybe a few more. Type 2 diabetes, which is a completely different animal. We have close to guesstimated or estimated or ChatGPT'd or Googled, whatever you want to do, you will reach a figure around 500 million people. Talk to us about the type 2s, mate.
So the only thing kind of type 1 and type 2 diabetics share is the insufficient amount or utilization of insulin. The way they got there and the treatment process of that, or the potential longevity of that, is very different from disease to disease. So type 1 diabetics don't produce any insulin. Type 2 produce it, but due to several factors, 99.9% self-inflicted of that insulin they produce, it's poorly utilized, and you have a low sensitivity to it.
Let's not bash the type 2, but let's be quite straightforward. That's pretty savage. 99%, you said. There's not, 99%, because there'll always be a little bit of a loophole, but it's completely self-inflicted due to poor environments, lifestyle choices, call it what you will, the way you get there. Yeah. That's quite savage. So, and that 500 million, give or take, doesn't actually include what's almost probably a bigger number and an increasing number in the category of what we have. And I don't know, is there a way to define pre-diabetic?
It's a spectrum.
How do I get into that? Not that I want to get into that category.
Yeah, so we have about 500 million type 2 diabetics. And I mean, this is off the top of my head. I would guarantee it's probably double that for pre-diabetics, right? Mental. But it's your type 2 diabetics aren't type 2 diabetics until they've got the diagnosis, but I guarantee they've been type 2 diabetic for a year or two before that. Yeah, it's not an immediate, you wake up and you're type 2 diabetic. Yeah. So it is self-inflicted 99% of the time. I'm sure there's some disorders and some conditions and other medication that causes it. But it's self-inflicted from 2 factors, basically. It's under-exercising and carbohydrate-addicted individuals.
Savage, but true.
It's the saturated. I mean, I'm not saying it's their fault they're carbohydrate-addicted. Maybe there's some emotional eating disorder. Maybe there's, poverty, which is huge. All this kind of stuff. It's not I'm not saying it's 100% their fault, but I'm saying it's 100%, well, 99% self-inflicted.
Yeah. It's yeah. And I guess for some people, maybe it's not self-inflicted because it's sadly a young child who has been brought up in an environment where those factors are super prevalent, where lifestyle is very sedentary and also carbohydrate intake is excessive.
Yeah, definitely.
Generally, sugar on ice cream is excessive. I mean, carbohydrate is. Yeah. But we still see and I don't have the stats on it, but there's a lot of countries in the world that are, carbohydrate is their main source of fuel. For example, in Africa, and we actually do have some quite tough diabetes problems in those countries as well. So it's not all just in the sort of more developed world and people eating too many ice creams.
No. I mean, even eating, I'm sure even if you ate enough whole grain, unprocessed carbohydrates, and that's all you did and you didn't exercise, you'd probably still develop type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Yeah, the body's meant for variety and meant for exercise.
Is there... I know you won't answer this. You'll try and be politically correct for this one, mate. But is there how's the relationship between type 1 diabetics and type 2 diabetics? Do you wink at each other, or do you sort of just it's...
It depends, right? I mean, I've had numerous amounts of type 2 diabetics, but we're both diabetic, and it's like we're in the same boat together.
Yeah. We are,
we're not, you know, if the boat was sinking and there needs to be someone off the boat, the type 2 diabetics are going.
Oh, savage. I think that's fair though, right? Yeah. But when if we look at it from now we've got the dirty part out of the way, mate, if we look at it from a really proactive standpoint, the way that you've learned from a young age over the last sort of 9 years to deal with it, to perform well, to mentally consume it in a positive way, which it seems that you really have done. Those are all things that you can actually share in common with a type 2 and almost help them, I guess.
Definitely right. I mean, if you want to play victim to the condition, you can. Yeah. In type 1, type 2, any condition. But if you want to be proactive and control the controllables and just do your best at the end of the day, even if you get it wrong. Just try and actively do your best towards either helping yourself out or helping those around you by managing your condition better. That's the most important thing. And whether that's the type 1 diabetic doing that or a type 2 or whatever it is, then I've got no problem with you, you know? It's when people, I mean, again, it might not be 100% in their control, but when people fall victim to their own condition and wallow and, then there's some mindset issues that need to be adjusted.
Which, to be fair, if you are a type 2 and you have come through those poor environmental, sedentary lifestyle factors, you could be, from a mindset standpoint, you could be actually at quite a low point anyway, because you are a victim to a certain way.
Definitely.
You don't need to be a victim to yourself, and you don't need to continue to be a victim. But we're brought up, and it's tough, but we're brought up by people that bring us up in a certain way. Yeah. And that might not always be our choice. I can't remember what the exact numbers on the study, but I think if you're obese by the age of 10 years old, you're over 80%. You're over 80% chance, or 80% of those obese children will be obese for the rest of their lives. Yeah. And that's savage.
And no 10-year-old intentionally becomes obese out of their own doing. And I'm also sure no parent intentionally gets their child obese out of their own doing. Maybe it's a lack of education on either side. Yeah. But I'm sure if you said...
Lack of education, lack of awareness. Yeah. It's tough.
Everyone wants their child healthy, right? And you'd hope.
You'd hope. That's a whole other show, right?
Yeah. But whether
it'd be quite a good one. Anyway, we're both not parents, so we're probably not overly qualified to talk about that. So we'll move to the other side and to the more positive side, where you've obviously got some really strong athletic goals, mate, and you help people as well who have either type 1 or type 2 diabetes. At what point does it, we've spoken about a victim mindset and just taking ownership of it. And I get that. But sometimes there must be this thought of, I'm a little bit hamstrung here, because maybe from an athlete standpoint, or you've heard it from clients, but it's like, I don't have what that person has. So the playing field, is it level? Do you ever feel that it's level, or is it not level? How do you feel about that?
Personally, it's totally level.
Is it?
Yeah,
that's
personally. Cool. But from, again, I can't speak for the type 2 diabetic. Maybe that's, if I'm honest, they're not going to have necessarily the same performance goals, but they're going to have health goals. And there's going to be challenges in the way, for sure, as much as education as it is practical intervention. But I think that again, it could be worse. You could have a worse condition than type 1 or type 2 diabetes. And I haven't met someone yet who is doing absolutely everything they can to improve their condition, and it's not improving.
Do you have associations within like diabetics in sport? Am I making that up? I mean, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. Googled diabetes in sports, and the first thing that comes up is people with diabetes shouldn't exercise. I mean, you obviously keep on reading, but it then says if they have high levels of ketones in their blood, because this can make them really sick. Yeah. So Google's a bit, but I think there are some groups of like diabetics in sport, right? Type 1.
I don't know if there's maybe governing bodies or support organizations. I'm not sure. I know there's some specialist doctors that do a lot of research in diabetes and its relation with sport. And I know there's diabetic only sports teams, right? Who again would have their doctors on hand who would advise and work together, work collaboratively. But I don't think there's any, not that I know of. And if there is, maybe comment or whatever you do in this session.
Did you have you connected with people in CrossFit that have diabetes?
There's a few. I mean, my goal it would be my goal. So my goal as an individual in the CrossFit is to qualify for the CrossFit Games, regardless if I'm diabetic or not. But if I do it currently, I believe that I would be the only type 1 diabetic to qualify for the open division.
Wow.
I know there's a type 1 diabetic in the teens. I think she's a teenager, a female. And I'm very confident that in the open division, there hasn't been one yet.
That's cool.
I'm sure there's probably one in the Masters, maybe. I mean, maybe not. CrossFit's a small sport and there's only 10 million of us. So, so maybe not.
Still, mate, I think that's you see it in a really positive way. Yeah. And you're proving it through your athletic performance, which is inspiring for me, for the people in our community. I'm sure it could be super inspiring for the people that are diabetics, type 1 especially, and have suffered for a short time or a long time. I think it's something really cool.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I don't know how they're doing this season, but there's a great documentary I'd recommend everyone to watch, and it is the Novo Nordisk type 1 diabetic cycling team.
Yeah, right.
Every rider on the team's type 1 diabetic, and there's some of the science that goes behind those guys and the drama, maybe you would call it, is a good watch. It's a good watch for sure.
We'll have to have a look at it. Training diabetics. What's your approach, mate? Is there 2 or 3 things that you look out for? If I was to come to you as a type 2 diabetic, I appreciate what you say. I haven't, I'm the 99. It's my fault, but I'm here. I want to be better. You know about type 1. You figured it out. How do you approach training someone as a personal trainer with either type 1 or type 2?
Yeah. So let's start with type 2. Mm-hmm. Okay. So obviously there's quite a few medications out there now with, as we discussed pre-podcast, semaglutide and metformin and X, Y, and Z. And we're going to kind of brush over those and assume that you're in a place where you can train without collapsing and dying on the floor. I mean, that training might not look that intense. It might just be a walk around the block or X, Y, and Z. Yeah. But let's assume you can train and you're not going to die. Yeah. Okay. Touch wood. For the approach to them, so exercise, type 2 diabetes is caused from two things. So high glucose food, basically, or food that is going to increase your blood glucose levels, and the underutilization of exercise. So imagine the body's a system. So of our system, 80% of total glucose consumed from food is absorbed by the skeletal muscle.
Right.
Which is a huge amount.
Yeah,
so
right.
your biggest store in the body of glycogen and glucose is your skeletal muscle system.
Right.
So obviously through training, through X, Y, and Z, we can not only increase the potential volume of those stores through increasing your skeletal muscle mass, but also we can increase the uptake of glucose into those stores through exercising. So when we exercise, during contraction, there is certain proteins and transmembrane proteins that uptake glucose.
Right.
So during lots of like cyclical contractions, like sitting on a bike, we can uptake glucose without insulin, which is huge for type 2, type 1, and non-diabetics.
Yeah.
And so you can have glucose-free, insulin-free glucose uptake during exercise, which is why it's the number one treatment process for type 2 diabetics that don't respond to medication is exercise. Because not only is it effective, but there's some processes in the body that only respond to exercise, not drugs. So with that glucose, with that glucose uptake, it is purely exercise dependent. So you're not going to get that stimulus or that response through taking drugs.
Yeah.
You have to exercise to get that glucose uptake.
So, that's a pretty good way to wrap it up, mate. If you're type 1, if you're type 2, this is a guy. Not only can he tell you how to inject, when to inject, how to monitor, but he said it in black and white there. There's a lot of stuff that can be done with drugs, but there's actually a lot that just needs to be done with physical exercise. And I think a lot of it, though, mate, which is where your mindset is quite unique. A lot of it is for type 2, the mindset and the relationship around sport and physical exercise, 90% of the time is going to be quite poor. Definitely. Because it is a sedentary, bad food, bad lifestyle disease.
I couldn't agree more. And not only that, they probably, for a lot of these people, it's intimidating.
Yeah.
The people around or associated with exercises like myself and yourself, right? For a lot of these overweight type 2 diabetics, it's going to be intimidating. Yeah. And the perceived emotion of that outcome of exercise is going to be tough.
Yes.
And it will be, but it doesn't mean it's unmanageable. Yep. You know, even if it's a walk around the block, they're still beneficial in some ways. It may be a walk that you wouldn't have done previously. Yeah. And I mean, I was listening to a podcast recently of a coach that used to work here, and he had that story of one of his clients lost 150 kilos. Yeah. And they started with seated exercises. Losing weight through not even standing on their own with their own body weight, just through movement seated. It's movement they wouldn't have done otherwise. And so there's always a starting point. They may be tough, maybe some conversations you have to figure it out with, but there can always be a starting point for sure.
That's diabetes. 10 million of you, 500 million of them, plus another load. Yeah. We won't continue that battle. Mate, super insightful, super useful. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is the way that you looked at managing it and not holding you back, which probably can be applied on a lot of things that people might be going through or might have gone through or might be yet to go through. You've navigated a way around it, and that's exciting, mate. And hopefully that's quite a good outcome for the show as well. The first type 1 diabetic to the CrossFit Games.
That's the aim.
With the flag.
We'll see. I don't know. There might be somewhere.
I think there is. I think we might be surprised in this one, mate. It's I think that gives people a lot of encouragement in a way as well.
Hope so.
Yeah. Very good. Toby, show number 2. Appreciate it, mate. We'll get you back on to talk about something else in a lot of detail sometime soon. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.